Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome back to the Formed Book Club. We are continuing to discuss saints and sinners in the Cristero War of Mexico in the first third of the 20th century. So far, I think we've seen more sinners than saints, but there probably are more sinners than saints, generally speaking. We're going to take up our conversation with chapter 4, the Cristeros and the dilemma of violence. What's the dilemma? Well, especially should priests get involved in carrying guns and using them.
And when is the use of violence justified by anybody?
By the way, I would say, strictly speaking, violence is never justified. Violence used to mean the unlawful use of force, whereas force could be either lawful or unlawful. But now the meaning of the word is changing so that people now use violence to what used to be considered a lawful use of force. It's unfortunate, I think, because it's a good distinction to make.
It is.
But in this case, let's use the old distinction. When is use of force legitimate?
Yes.
And is it ever legitimate for a priest?
Right.
And I would say right away, I would never want to bear arms as a priest. I would never want to defend myself. But if I saw somebody attacking your granddaughter and I saw a gun nearby, I would use it.
I would too.
I think you completely encapsulate the situation. You know that priests should not willfully be involved in violence, but obviously they have the right to defend others. Whether they have the right to defend themselves, I suppose. I mean, that's whether, in other words, you are morally obligated as a priest not to defend yourself, or whether that's just a moral choice you make as an individual priest, is a different discussion. But there's no doubt at all that you have the right to defend the innocent and the weak from an unjustified violent attack upon them. And indeed, if you are in a position to prevent that attack and do nothing, I'd even say that you are actually committing a sin of omission.
So does that cover this chapter? No, it does not.
I think it plays into the discussion. I mean, there's a whole section here on a moral dilemma. And I like the fact he begins with a discussion of the 1986 film The Mission and some of the issues raised in that film as a way of sort of popularizing the moral discussion. But, you know, that we see here that there are priests being canonized, that even if they weren't lifting arms themselves, using arms themselves, they were certainly part of that war effort and were ministering to those who were combatants. So I think that the question is answered by the magisterium of the church in the sense that they've actually canonized some of these priests that fought and were martyred during that war.
But were the ones who've been canonized actually bearing arms, or were they chaplains to those who were? The ones who've been canonized.
But the issue is, of course, they are involving themselves in the war effort as allies, active service allies, in the sense that they're ministering the sacraments to those who are bearing arms.
No, so, that doesn't make you competent, though. I mean, we allow chaplains on both sides of an unjust war. You know?
Yes, but the discussion. I agree with that. I have no argument in that. But the discussion, particularly last week, we talked about this when the issue of the just war theory was first raised by the author. That clearly these priests believed they were assisting in a just war, ministering to combatants in a just war, and had been canonized by the church for doing so. So I think that answers the questions that the author raises about the legitimacy of priests being involved in what we can consider to be a just war.
Well, what if you are a priest on the other side of an unjust war, ministering to the soldiers who are following orders? I think, for example, our wonderful book, In the Shadow of His Wings, Father, what's his name? Goldman, yes. Goldman. He was in the SS for a while, and he was serving German soldiers in World War II, who I believe were unjustly, invading parts of Europe. I don't think he would be disbarred from being canonized because he was serving those who were on the just side of a war.
Right. Because those Catholic soldiers were conscripted against their will, and they have spiritual needs. And often, chaplains, no matter what side of the war they're on, chaplains very often see to the dying on both sides.
Yeah, and that's a very good point, and I have no argument with that.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, it's not so good. Arguments are good.
Well, it brings up, though, this particular case of this Father Vega.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I mean, to bring it back to the book, he's talking about this particular man, Father Vega, who did take up arms. He was a priest. And, even if the principle were to allow for this sort of thing, the fact is that he disobeyed his bishop to do it. And I think that is also a very big issue for a priest to be doing something that is morally ambiguous in the first place, to take up arms and to disobey his bishop to do it. I think we're looking at a man who's getting himself into a little bit of trouble. And then the fact that he did kind of, then live a bit of a colorful life, and got himself quite a reputation and gave scandal. I think we're showing that, those boundaries that were given are there for a reason.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's no one's going to argue that General Father Vega, is going to be canonized.
Right.
I would. The only thing I would quibble about, and it's not quibbling about him, quibbling about the fact that it's morally ambiguous to take up arms. I think it's not morally ambiguous to take up arms if it's definitely in a just cause.
Yes, although I think even priests should not take up arms in a just cause.
I wasn't talking about priests. Sorry, the phrase was, the phrase that Vivian used, perhaps inadvertently, was a morally ambiguous thing such as taking up arms, and that's
meaning a priest taking up arms.
Oh, sorry. In that case, absolutely fine. I just clarifying.
Right. And I mean, I'm all for having canonized Joan of Arc.
And she didn't take up arms.
Well, that's true, too.
She did not bear arms. She bore the standard, and she led from the front, but she herself did not use lethal force. And that's so interesting, right? And also in the fields of the dying, she went to the English side as well to give prayer and comfort and everything. So, I mean, we're looking at a very extraordinary woman there who is mobilizing the men to do the fighting. And we have women like that in this story, don't we? We have Joan of Arc's in this story, which might not... Yeah, they show up in this chapter, the Women's Brigade on page 93.
Yeah.
And they come...
Amazing.
Yeah, and they come up later as well.
There's 25,000 of them.
Amazing.
And then they wanted to maintain silence to be effective. Not a single defection no one ever broke the silence. Can you believe that? I mean,
or at least they didn't snitch when somebody did.
Yeah.
No, I'm sort of teasing. Yeah, no, it's remarkable to have 25,000 people and women and not get any loose talk out of it. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to say that, ladies, but the truth is what it is.
No, that really amazed me in this whole Mexican story, the role of the women, not just being pious and going to church. Yes, women do that. That's great. But they were actually leading the resistance.
Right, with ammunition and intelligence and care of the wounded and goading the men to get out there and fight. And Yeah, they were a huge, huge part of this.
We said of World War II also with the resistance. I think in France especially, there were young girls would go in. I remember there's one girl in southern France where the Germans had a tank park. She's 13 years old, but she learned about these tanks and she snuck in there and she loosened took off the oil cap from the crankcase for all the tanks.
Oh my goodness!
And when they headed out to Normandy. They went about 5 miles and they came to a halt.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing. I mean, the reticent resistance in Elizabethan and Jacobean England, it was the women that were the forefront of that. In actual fact, that the men often were not as overt because it was the men that were being fined for disobeying the laws, whereas the wife could disobey the laws and because of the way the law was worded, get away with it more. But absolutely, the women were major heroines in that English resistance also. So, yeah.
Well, I know I'm getting a little off the mark here, but as we speak, it is the mothers who are resisting the very corrosive critical race theory in the schools. They're going to the school board meetings.
Yep.
And they're organizing. It's a very powerful force.
Yep.
Yep. The other thing as well, and it mentions somewhere, I've highlighted the passage, I can't remember which chapter it's in, I've highlighted quite a lot, but it mentions there's not too much documentation about the women's involvement in the Cristero War. And again, that parallels the situation in England. If what you're doing is illegal, right, you're not consigning anything to paper. There is no paper trail. So, and then if no one's talking too much for the same reason, there's not much by way of any sort of documentary evidence at the time. It's only what is spoken about afterwards. And it's frustrating for historians, but of course necessary to history.
Right. That's exactly right. Well, back to a little bit as to the role of taking up arms. On page 85, he points out that the bishops themselves were divided on whether or not the war was justified. So you had only 6 out of 38. Only 6 bishops out of the 38 Mexican bishops were in favor of the war. 12 were actively opposed, and the rest, do your math, were uncommitted.
Yeah, that sounds like bishops.
On that same page, by the way, and this goes back to a discussion of what's moral or not, there was a bishop who was supplying cartridges to the Cristeros. He was eventually removed from his diocese by OC. I'm not sure for that reason, but what about that? Supplying cartridges.
He didn't fire him.
No, that's right.
Speaking of moral ambivalence, from page 87, and there's other mentions also. Again, the role of the United States government. Actually, the Mexican army was well equipped with ammunition because it was being supplied from the United States at the time,
right.
And of course there had to be an opposition from the Catholics in the United States to point this out, and especially I think someone, I can't remember, saying that the United States does not recognize the Soviet Russia, but it has no problem at all not just recognizing but arming Soviet Mexico.
That's right. That's right. Well, and as often is the case, it's the oil, you see. I mean, there were. I saw a funny cartoon once. This is a digression. 2 crusaders are on horseback going through these olive groves, and the one crusader turns to the other and says, it's all about the oil. But fortunately, because of what you just mentioned, Joseph, the fact that Catholics in America, especially the Knights of Columbus,
yes.
Began organizing and lobbying their representatives and so on, and and eventually the U.S. switched sides and began to put pressure on the Mexican government to stop this. And so, yes, unfortunately, though, 200,000 Mexicans lost their lives in this war. 200,000.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that's obviously a very high price, but who's to know how far the oppression and endeavored destruction of the church would have gone if there had been no resistance.
I'm not blaming the resistance for those numbers. I'm saying that the U.S. bears some of the responsibility for those numbers because they were supplying the Mexican army against their own people until enough pressure got them to change their mind, change policy.
Well, here's another moral question. I want to go back to page 80 and 81, where the author explains that there was no real starting date for this war. There's little uprisings here and there, resistance here and there. But on August 1st, 1926, the unintended trigger, an order from the Mexican bishops to suspend all sacramental activity, no mass, no confession. And what happened on page 81, the new paragraph there, for average parishioners, it was very simple. Plutarco Elias Calles was taking away their priest. So I had this question earlier about, does that make sense to deprive the people of the Eucharist? Talk about making Eucharist into a political weapon.
Yes.
But apparently, according to this author, that was what energized, mobilized the faithful to resist.
Well, and when we read a little further, he keeps mentioning the presidency of Calles as being, the one who really upped the war effort against the church. And so, but you kind of have to go back and forth to put it together that suspension of the sacraments happened after Calles passed his laws to make the 1917 Constitution implemented, to force its implementation, because up until then, even though it was anti-church and anti-clerical, it had not been enforced uniformly throughout Mexico. And so that's why a lot of people had kind of the impression that, what's the problem? But then when Calles became president and passed what became known as Calles Law, it not only forced the implementation of the 1917 Constitution, but it went even further by, this gets spelled out in more detail between 109 and 111. He immediately closed even more schools and convents, expelled more foreign-born clergy, then unveiled a decree that shocked everyone, the decree that ordered every Catholic priest in the nation to register with the state immediately. And then the light went on. Well, no wonder the bishops didn't want public masses, because then they were just sitting ducks to get rounded up and to be forced to be registered, because what the 1917 Constitution did was it gave to the legislature the right to decide how many priests could serve in a particular area. So
I would just really question something about the author's approach to this, because I'm also piecing stuff together here. And certainly the view of the government was that, thanks be to God, well, not thanks be to God, they don't believe in God. they were very happy for the masses and the sacraments to be suspended. I think there's even the prediction that for every year that there's no practice of the Catholic faith, there'll be a 2% drop in the number of adherents to the Catholic faith. And who knows, actually, if that had carried on. And the extent to which possibly the suspension of the sacraments was an act of cowardice on the part of the hierarchy. I don't know. Obviously, the reaction of the faithful was what triggered things, and thanks be to God for that. But the motive of the hierarchy for the action, and certainly the response of the secularist government to it, would suggest that the latter was certainly thinking this was a good thing.
Right. Now, we have to be a little bit clear here that it was the suspension of public worship. So basically the sacraments went underground, because there was still sacraments going on, but they went underground. And so, but I can see why. It wasn't until I read further that I began to see, well, if they're going to force the priests to register, and then they can pick and choose which ones can stay, which ones can go. In some states in Mexico, they are forcing priests to marry, which I think went beyond the actual written law. But once you give so much power to the state over the clergy, Some priests were forced to marry. So by going into hiding, just putting the whole church underground, it's possible the bishops thought they were protecting the clergy.
I mean, and I don't know. I mean, all I'm doing is querying from the perspective of,
Right.
trying to look at the whole fact. But certainly, we found with the suspension of the sacraments, under duress, obviously, with the COVID outbreak in those parts of the country where the faith was weakest, there's been a definite drop off in the number of people returning to mass. In those parts of the country where the shall we say, the faith is stronger, there's not been such a drop off. So I think that the whole idea that if you take the sacraments away, then people will just get out of the habit. If they get out of the habit, if it was only a habit and not really something more devout, then they will not come back.
Right. Well, there's a big article about this in the Wall Street Journal last week that numbers of attendance in person are down 30 to 50% nationwide, not just in the Catholic Church, but all religious confessions, 30 to 50%. But that's the people showing up. There's still a lot of people, especially the elderly, who are continuing to do streaming and this kind of thing in the places where that's still permitted. So it was interesting. The article, they were interviewing different members of the clergy from different churches, and some of them were saying, well, they're just getting more creative about meeting the needs of their people. And as you just said, though, Joseph, the more the practice was, in fact, something not just habitual or perfunctory, the more it has, endured.
Attendance at the mass that we go to regularly has actually increased by about 20% during the outbreak, and in parts of the country where it's been more habitual than devout, such as parts of the northeast. I don't want to mention particular cities. It's dropped off dramatically. And people just were only going through the motions anyway, and they got out of the habit of going through the motions, and they think, well, who needs it? So I'm really just sort of looking at the bigger picture. Well, obviously, where people are really devout, you take the sacraments away, they're going to be distraught and want to do something about it. But if people just maybe think, well, it's not a big deal, then it's not a big deal.
Right.
I just read an article that was written by Professor Joseph Ratzinger in 1958 when he was 31 years old. It's a wonderful article, but what he says is that there are pagans in the church. And the reason there are pagans in the church is that from the Middle Ages onward, for centuries, the church was part of the culture. Mm-hmm. And therefore, whether you're a Catholic or not didn't necessarily depend upon you making a decision.
That's right.
And he says that now that the secularization has increased and the church is no longer the dominant culture, we are going to we must come back to a more intentional church. Mm-hmm. And number one, that will be an attractive force for those who are really seeking. But here was a very interesting thing, especially he quoted these passages about the gate is narrow and few will enter, and many are called, few are chosen. He said, we began, Jesus was the one, and we were the many. All sinners, all in need of redemption. But he came to redeem all of us. Mm-hmm. And now we who are called are meant to be the one for the redemption of the many. It doesn't mean that those who are the habitual ones are going to hell.
No, not necessarily.
It means that we are the ones that are going to try and be an extension of Christ, redeeming the many. It's very good.
I'm so glad you said this, because I often tell people, let's say they're the only member of their family practicing the faith, they've had a conversion, they've joined the church, or maybe they've reverted back to the faith and no one else in the family is. And I say, just remember, every time you're there for them. You were the one who's been called, but the purpose of it is to bring in everybody. So I'm so glad to hear you say something that sometimes I just say things and I don't even know if they're true. So it's good to have some backup occasionally.
Well, and this to see the young Joseph Ratzinger saying this so beautifully and so clearly. It was really, it was phenomenal.
The church is here for the world. So those of you who are there praying, you're praying for the rest who aren't there. But bringing up the role of the church in all this, I did want to point out, especially since this coming Sunday is Feast of Christ the King, that feast,
Cristero.
yes, and Vivo Cristero, that feast was proclaimed during this time of the persecution of the church in Mexico and other places where communism and so on was afoot. And I don't know if everybody knows that. So on page 86, devotion, because he's talking about how their cry was Viva Cristo Rey, right, as they went into battle or as they were being martyred, Viva Cristo Rey, long live Christ the King. And he points out at the bottom of 86, devotion to Christ the King had been widespread in Mexico well before this time, but it was validated by Pope Pius XI when he instituted the Feast of Christ the King the year before, 1925, in response to the rise of secular governments that were trampling on religious freedom in Europe and Mexico.
Yeah.
So this Sunday at Christ the King Mass, pretend like you're standing up and saying, Viva Cristo Rey.
Also on page 86, he mentions that the first city of immigration to California began during this time. And we're the beneficiaries of that, Ignatius Press specifically, because for 27 years, our office was in a residence, an apartment, contiguous with the Carmelite monastery. Where did that come from? In 1927, Carmelites in Mexico City emigrated and came to San Francisco. There's a fascinating story there that they lived in a kind of a shack across the University of San Francisco. And one day, some old woman came in to visit the president of the university, Jesuit presidents, and came to see the secretary. I'd like to talk to the president. Well, no, you don't have an appointment. I want to make a donation. Well, why don't you see the Carmelites across the street? So she went across the street and gave him $1 million, which in those days was a lot of money. And they built the Carmel there.
Well, the property too.
Yeah.
That property was hers. And to think that if USF had gotten that just goes to show you, don't treat shabby old people shabbily.
That's right.
They just might be carrying $1 million in their pocket. But
it's also, the thing that's encouraging about all of this is that it is the hand of providence in history. Because whenever we feel that, that the power of secularism has become omnipotent, we see how things play themselves out in decades later. And we only live for 70 years, so we don't see the full picture. That's the advantage of knowing history. But the French Revolution was instrumental in softening the attitudes of the English towards the Catholic faith and actually paved the way for Catholic emancipation and the Catholic revival. So, the persecution in one area and all those exiled priests and that came to England changed the culture in England. The same thing as with the Cristero War, with the immigration into California. So, that there are multiple ramifications which we, in the heat of the moment, at the time itself, could not possibly see.
That's right. That's right, Joseph. And by the way, he mentions on 117 another religious community that came to San Francisco, the Sisters of Perpetual Adoration.
Adoratrices.
The ones in the Haight.
Yeah, Adoratrices.
Yeah. So he mentions them by name. He doesn't mention the Carmelites, at least not so far.
No, he didn't.
But both of these cloistered groups of women came here to San Francisco, and just think what a different place San Francisco would be if they weren't here.
Well, exactly,
because they're praying for the whole city.
You remember Abraham arguing with God, if we can find 40 just men here, we save it, 30, 20, even 10? Didn't find that. I often tell people why California is not dropped off into the Pacific. We've got many more than 10 just men here. We've got Carmelite convents, and we got Adoratrices, we got Poor Clares.
Yep.
They're praying for us.
And I remember one of the mothers superior at the Carmel that you mentioned, who had come out shortly after the Cristero War. She wasn't in the original group, but it wasn't long afterward. Yeah. But in any case, she said every night before she goes to bed, she's gone to her reward now, she would first face east, west, north, south, praying for the whole city before she retired every night. We're not going to know till we get to the other side.
That's right.
The prayers, the power of prayer that saved your bacon.
Now, on page 90, he talks about how the Cristeros, who were poorly armed, poorly equipped, and so on, why they were so successful for as long as they were. 4 reasons. One is high morale. And I love this one. This is Catholic faith. Towards the bottom of the page. Some elderly Catholics saw the war as an easy way to the next world. Quote, "We need to earn our way to heaven now that it's cheaper," one said. I love that.
Yep.
Can I be the sort of voice of dissonance here as well, though, if I may? Pages 104, 105, he sort of defends Caius, and he deserves credit in spite of his anti-Catholicism. And the examples he gives are curious. So he establishes a central banking system, the Bank of Mexico. He compares it to the Federal Reserve System. So basically, putting the government and the centralization of the economy hand in hand. He expands a network of schools. He establishes a public school system for the mass indoctrination of the people. He confiscates church-owned lands, and that's apparently a good thing. He has conducted a program against alcoholism, which is really actually a program against alcohol. It's not the same thing. In other words, prohibition, or moves towards that. So, he says at the end here, who should be able to reach out a hand to the poor, he says. Only one agency, the government. So only the government can reach out to the poor. This is the end of this paragraph, long paragraph saying Caius isn't that bad. And he says, by American standards, it would be considered socialism. But Caius made it work for the Mexico of his time. I think by any standards, it's considered socialism, and it wasn't working. In fact, it led to civil war.
I had that underlined exclamation point in the margin. Same thing, Joseph.
But
sort of small minds, I think. But anyway.
Well, but they're laced in here, though, as we talked about in our first session about this book, how there were some things in Mexican society, inequalities and such that the church had actually been part of. And so we talked about how now sometimes putting everything in its right place, because this church-owned lands you're talking about, this was the agrarian reform program to give individual farmers their own plots of land. And so they broke up the big haciendas so that the peasants could have their own little farms.
But the coupling of their haciendas with church land here is an oversimplification. It reminds me of the English Reformation. If the church is using its land unjustly, it's something for the church to sort out, not for the government to confiscate.
I'm not justifying what they're doing. I'm just saying it's a mixed bag. And now the church, because it had been so much part of the aristocracy in Europe and then in Mexico, that I'm just saying, I'm not saying it's all good. I'm just saying it's a mixed...
We agreed about that last week. I was merely talking about that one paragraph where the author equates overt socialism with something which was progressive, which we should allow someone who's persecuting the church some leeway because he's doing good socialist things. Now, those things that I listed are not good things.
I want to make a distinction here, though. The land that's broken up was not church land, at least not primarily. It was these haciendas owned by wealthy people who were not the church, I think we're almost overstepping our self-imposed limits here.
Yes,
but so let's conclude with a few marks. Next week, any residual remarks on this chapter we'll continue the next 2 chapters. But let's read on. Mm-hmm. I would say let's read on till the end of the book, really. So we're ready to discuss that. Mm-hmm. Does that sound fair enough, Joseph? All right. Good. Thank you all. Thanks for watching, listening. God bless you. See you next week on Formed Book Club.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Formed Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.